on today's World Insight. With 100 nations adopting the crucial Kunming Declaration on Biodiversity, now comes the part of buckling down to work in meeting targets. The United Nations Development Program Director in China talks about that work and more.
It's a triple crisis also, so we have the biodiversity crisis, we have the climate crisis, and we have the COVID crisis, recovering from the pandemic.
And Danish Ambassador to China Thomas Østrup Møller opens up about his thoughts on China's biodiversity effort.
When we are exploiting nature, it comes back and it will punish us.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Last week, more than 100 countries adopted the Kunming Declaration, in which they declared that putting biodiversity on a path to recovery is a defining challenge of this decade and mark a big push to carry out a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The declaration also recognized that efforts fell short of meeting previous targets. Of course, what I'm talking about is the just concluded COP15 first stage meeting in Kunming. So how was the mood like at the Biodiversity Summit? And what are some of the best ways to get to the targets? UNDP's Beate Trankman spoke at the event, and she also listened to many speeches and conversations there. I asked her about her most important takeaways.
If you listen to the Secretary General, and he's been on record on this a number of times now, and he uses very strong language, right? He basically keeps saying we need to stop the war on nature because we're losing the fight, right? It is not nature that needs us, it is us that needs nature. There is a common realization and a common tone in the debate, which basically says it's an existential crisis, it's a triple crisis also, so we have the biodiversity crisis, we have the climate crisis, and we have the COVID crisis, recovering from the pandemic while tackling the other two crises. And that basically means that we need to pull together, we need to put our action where our mouth is, and we need to put our finance where our mouth is.
Talking about finance, I really want to follow up on this. I know the UNDP has been doing some job in that regard as well, but you know, how should we be able to make sure that the finance thing will not become just rhetoric, but real actions, both about how to do it, who to contribute to, and who to contribute. All these are important issues. Tell me more about your thoughts.
This is not a price or a burden, a cost burden to shoulder. This is actually an investment into our future. If we achieve the SDGs by 2030, the projections are that we would add about, I think it's 12 trillion in economic growth to the global economy. If you look at people depending on fisheries, water, oceans, that's a $3 trillion marketplace a year. 3 billion people.
It's really about the mindset, how you
look at things. It is about the mindset,
the perceptions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, you know what? The good news is we have the tools. It's all about redirecting nature negative and climate negative investments and turn them into nature positive and climate positive investments.
But there is a time difference. You know, people have been talking about this, the energy crisis, for example. I mean, at least apparent energy crisis, for example. People say, do we want to pay that price have to suffer from energy shortage, at least for the short term, for that energy transition?
Yeah, so I think there are several things there. Of course, you're not going to switch over from one day to the next.
No.
And you, of course, have the energy security issues, right? And those are real issues. But I think the point is to be much more ambitious in the exit strategies, right? Because at the end of the day, we won't tackle climate change if we don't exit from coal and if we don't exit from fossil fuel energy generation. And the energy can be generated through other sources, right? Through solar, through wind, through hydrogen. And China actually is a leader in this, right? China has 1/3 of installed solar power capacity globally and 1/4 of wind power capacity. It's a question of getting the energy from where it's produced to where it's needed. That's part of it. The other part is the finance, right? We need to put a price on carbon, because unless we do this, we don't penalize investments into resources that actually at the end of the day destroy the planet and destroy the climate, right? China in the past has been such a big funder of coal. And of course other developing countries depend on energy. So if China now says we're actually going to redirect that into modern technologies for renewable energy, that's a breakthrough.
That is really one point I want to talk with you, because you've been this seasoned, shall I say, development expert. You've been working in various developing countries. How do you see, and as a development expert, the role of developing countries these days on the issue of biodiversity, on the issue of climate change, leading some of the thoughts about providing varieties of differences, solutions to the whole idea?
Yeah, I think developing countries have a very important role to play, and you use the word lead, and in some areas they are actually leading because they know that it impacts their economies and it is about the survival of their people. If you listen, for example, I thought this was fascinating, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, right? 87% of land still forested, right? And which is probably the highest in the world. I don't know, but I would suspect. And basically saying we've now realized that, we need to make sure that we protect that resource. And it's not by exporting timber that we will power our economies. So I think in the thought process, in the rhetoric, a lot of the developing countries, they have understood, right? Small island states, right? They're the first at the receiving end of rising sea levels, right? Which is why they speak so powerfully about it. But I think what is also clear is they need help, right? They need help to finance these transformations. And that's where the compact comes in, right?
China committed 1.5 billion RMB for the starting seed fund for developing countries, but that's only one drop, right? We need other drops of water into this pond. So where does that come from eventually?
China is willing to contribute and lead the efforts. But you're right, I mean 1.5 billion, we need renminbi, we need much more than that. Paris, of course, pledged 100 billion a year, right? We're not at the 100 billion a year for developing countries. And I think you were asking about my experience as a development practitioner. What I've seen in a lot of countries, especially the smaller developing countries, is that there is a lot of finance going into climate mitigation, right? Reducing emissions. But there isn't enough going into adaptation. And that is very important because we're already living in an era where climate change has become a reality. It is driving people off the land, right? And we also know that if you invest $1 into climate resilience, you get $4 to $5 in return in avoided costs. So I think a lot more needs to go into adaptation. Currently it's only 21%.
Right.
And there is a $70 billion need for adaptation funding, of which I think roughly 25% are currently funded. So I think we need to strengthen these compacts, right? And need to see that all of us are in this together. But there is also a lot, I think, that other than sort of funding and grant funding, right? Adaptation is grant funding. That countries can do, and countries like China, right? We're looking, for example, and the administrator was speaking about this, at a whole set of new tools to finance, right? One example would be nature performance bonds, right? Which is basically debt relief against verifiable performance on nature protection indicators, right? And with the COVID crisis and debt levels increasing, this type of tools are becoming even more important. Again, I think for China there is a really important opportunity that China is a big creditor, right, to a lot of the developing countries. So looking at these type of tools, nature performance bonds, would be, I think, a great opportunity for China, and I think we would certainly be ready to support this. We are already piloting these type of, as UNDP, these type of instruments in a number of countries, including some of China's partner countries like Pakistan, like others. So I think it's those type of compacts that we need.
Different countries have different circumstances. You know, as a development expert, how do you see that? You know, also how to see the different circumstances countries are facing, and as a result, the policies they can adopt, and at the same time, they commit to the international convention like this, like biodiversity, CBD. You know, how would all these work in a way?
Yeah, so I think, you know, that's the very reason why UNDP is present virtually all over the globe, right? We have offices in 129 countries covering 170 territories and countries. And what we're doing is basically working with countries through the planning, the policy strategies, looking at public budgets. How can you free up, for example, fiscal space for investments into the green economy transition, right? The ones to name there is stopping fossil fuel subsidies, right? That's an enormous amount. You can also, to incentivize as a country, as policymakers, right? You can provide tax breaks for businesses that are investing into green economy, green energy transformation, therefore redirecting finance. You can look at the type of market mechanisms that we were talking about before, carbon pricing, right? So it's basically a toolkit, right, that goes from the planning to the financing, and then also the capacities at country level to run the analytics, to know where the sweet spots are, the game changers for the investments that really accelerate progress. And that's what we do actually for a living, day in, day out. And you can only do that if you're on the ground in country. That's why we maintain our global network of offices.
But you look at the latest Kunming Declaration, talking about many different points, but how will this declaration in the city leading up to April, the second stage, and the real negotiation hammer out? How do you see this process?
I think what we're hoping is that, again, COP15 in April can become what Paris was for climate, right? Making these commitments much more concrete. Because the difference so far between the Biodiversity Convention and the Climate Convention, right, and the agreements that have been forged, is that the Biodiversity Conventions, they were missing these type of targets where you then can really start comparing also commitments of countries and basically report back and say, we're moving in the right direction. But let me say one more thing. I think what this April global 2020 post-global 2020 biodiversity framework will need to reflect is transformations in three areas. So one is really redefining the relationship between people and nature. And that is putting nature at the heart of everything that we do, of our policies, our plans, our strategies, and our financing. The second is looking at the governance of biodiversity. How is land use, water use being governed? And making sure that we move away from these sort of prioritizing short-term profits over long-term ecological and social well-being. And the third thing is looking at the finance and how can we really make an effort to redirect, as I said before, nature negative investments to become nature positive with all the tools that we have, right? The policy tools, but also the market tools. If Kunming can do that, then I think that will be a breakthrough, and that will really accelerate efforts to make sure that at the end of the day, we leave a planet behind for the next generation that is still livable.
My interview with Beate Trankman from the United Nations Development Program in Kunming. She heads the UNDP in China. After the break, I talked to Danish Ambassador to China, Thomas Møller, about his thoughts on China's biodiversity efforts. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Today we are looking back at the just concluded UN Biodiversity Conference in Kunming. As president of the COP15, China hosted phase 1 of the meeting last week and will host the second phase of the meeting early next year in Kunming again. If any country understands how challenging it can be to coordinate a global meeting like this, it would be Denmark, which hosted the UN Climate Summit in 2009. I met the Danish Ambassador Thomas Møller outside the conference hall in Kunming. Here is his thoughts on the latest. Mr. Ambassador, what a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Ms. Chinwei. It's a pleasure to be here, absolutely.
Now, you know, we are on the very top platform overlooking the COP15. What is your general impression? Is there likely to be some kind of success? Do you smell it?
I think so, because we have learned we have not delivered on what we promised. We still have an increasing loss of biodiversity. The curve is going up, and we have to break it somehow. And this is what we have to decide at the latest in April, where we hopefully reconvene here in Kunming.
Not long from now.
No, there's a lot of
very
work to do.
urgent task.
Yes.
So the Chinese president in his speech has been making several commitments. One is about the green advantages into economic development advantages, and also he talked about fairness in the transition and also in biodiversity protection. Mr. Ambassador, what do you make of these points?
I think it's important because, you know, no countries have the same point of departure. You know, the countries that industrialized early, they of course, they have been around and have been developed countries for some time. We have the developing countries taking off, and they also have a right to prosperity, of course. So there's a balance here. So we also have to take into account when we talk about biodiversity, as we do when we talk about climate, for example.
We have biodiversity of societies.
Yes, it is, exactly. And we also have to take into account that I think President Xi, he made quite a fine statement. He said that whenever we exploit nature, it comes back to us and punishes us. And the fact is that nature does not know, they do not respect borders. They have not sort of studied international law. So when we are exploiting nature, it comes back and it will punish us. So this actually is a testimony to the fact that this is an international task for all of us.
And you talk about the real multilateralism. As you may know, there were a lot of talks about what multilateralism means. Sometimes it means small groups, sometimes it means bigger groups. But to you, Mr. Ambassador, coming from the country of Denmark, that has always been working on multilateralism to survive and thrive. How do you make of that point?
I think it's important because, as you stated, we are a small country. We need an international rule-based system a true multilateral system. This is important. And I think it's right now we have an opportunity. It's a window of opportunity. We have the COP15 working. It has to be a truly international multilateral setting to take decision. That goes for the COP26 in 20 days as well. It has to be international.
Mr. Ambassador, you're coming from Denmark. In fact, the city of Copenhagen was the host city of a very dramatic climate change conference. We learned a lot of lessons, the world, from that one. But Copenhagen, the city itself, is a great host. Mr. Ambassador, what have you, in your diplomatic career, going through that period of time with the rest of the world, what have you learned? What have that teach us, do you think?
I think it's been a learning curve. We have been climbing, all of us. We have had sort of this scientific evidence that says we have to do something. And maybe the world was, I don't know, I'm just speculating now, maybe the world wasn't ready to take sort of decisive joint action in Copenhagen. That was unfortunate because we should probably have started a bit earlier. But again, we have been on a learning curve, and I think we have learned, and I really hope we are going to take some ambitious and decisive decisions at COP15 and as well as at COP26.
1.5 billion RMB, China has decided to make it as a seed fund for providing more assistance to developing countries in terms of protecting biodiversity. How much do you think these kinds of financial cooperation, what does that mean to all of us?
I think we need financing in order to get the job done. And we have to think of what kind of mechanism do we have to work with. I think it's very gracious, and I think it's very bold of China to commit this kind of funding for the developing countries. And I'm sure that this issue will also be subject to further discussions when we move ahead towards April as well.
Mr. Ambassador, I know you are very committed both on the issue of climate change, you yourself even personally, and the biodiversity issue. What do you consider personally?
The crucial point as a person, as an individual, as a citizen on planet Earth is actually to work with your mindset. You have to be an ambassador of change. We all have to be ambassadors of change. So this is important, and try to see what can you do. What kind of small things can you do in your daily life? And you have to think it through. But let's take an example of food loss, food waste. This is also high on the agenda in China, and this is so important because if you think that the cheapest resources we have are those we have already produced, and if we throw them away, it's quite expensive. So let's use what we have. There's another issue which is also, I sense is gaining momentum also in China and definitely also in Denmark. This is the issue of circular economy, that you have to reuse things. It can be used twice, 3 times, 4 times and so forth. This is also important. This is also something that would minimize the sort of, the impact on the climate as well.
Even though we have seen some quite positive momentum, there are still differences in opinions about what are the priorities, what percentage to commit, under what time frame, and whose responsibilities are they and how they should be shared. These are realistic questions. So, Mr. Ambassador, what do you see as some of the most important points in these negotiations from Denmark's perspective?
From the Danish perspective, this is that we have to pursue the issue of dedicating 30% of land, 30% of the sea as protected areas. So these are areas that we have to protect extra. That's one thing. The other thing that I believe is important, this is in particular something which is of priority to my government, this is the issue of nature-based solutions. You have to utilize the nature. It has gone through million years of evolution. It has come up with genius ways of sorting out problems. So why don't use it instead of destroying it? So this is important. One thing which is also important for us is also that we have to cooperate. We have to involve indigenous peoples as well. And because they have been working off and with the nature for thousands of years. They are, so to speak, the guardians of biodiversity.
The other thing, Mr. Ambassador, is about the ways to get there. As you can see, once again, the issues of developing countries and developed economies. Among the developed economies, Denmark is one of the very first to commit to climate change issues. But there are different opinions and voices. So how do you see this shared responsibility and at different stages and different times of development?
I don't see that people disagree that this is a shared responsibility, and the developed world will have to contribute. Take the example of climate financing, for example. We agreed in Copenhagen, by the way, to mobilize $100 million every year. We have not reached it. Hopefully we will reach that in Glasgow. My government has pledged $1 billion, and that's a fairly small country, every year, in order to provide resources for adaptation and climate mitigation around the world. So we need this commitment, and definitely the Danish government is committed to provide its share of this. And then I think it's important, because there will be disagreements, but you have to start a civilized conversation.
Do you get frustrated?
No.
If all the discussions just like gone, with the wind, as if nothing happened, no real commitment, no real fulfillment of the goals. Are you frustrated?
No, we have had progress, of course, but we have not achieved what we set out to achieve. So there is a momentum. There are people working. You have the young people. They're really pushing us. And we have to listen to them, because that's the world that we are creating for them for tomorrow. So we have to listen to their voices as well. So I think things are progressing. And basically, I take the view that you should look upon the world as a glass that is half full, not half empty.
I agree with that, particularly when we are covering meetings like this.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And before we go, Mr. Ambassador, I know you and your colleagues are not only working on the climate change issue, the biodiversity issue, and also working on cooperation with China on the Winter Olympics coming in just a few months. Tell me more about that.
That is going to be interesting. First of all, we are normally not a big winter sporting nation in Denmark. We don't have any mountains so forth. But as it happens, our ice hockey team, the men's hockey team, they qualified. So we are going to have a historic big delegation. So we're looking forward to it. And I know it's difficult to arrange because of the pandemic. But I look forward to a great event as well. But we're still in the early days of planning.
So we need to be creative.
I think we have to be creative, yes.
Mr. Ambassador, as always, what a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me today.
My interview with Danish Ambassador to China, Thomas Møller. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.